The world's a pretty big place. With our busy lives, no reasonable person can be expected to keep up with the biggest headlines each week, so I'm here to do it for you. This is Tony Pearson coming to you on behalf of WHIP with this week's Big Picture. We are going to be deviating a little bit this week and next week from the usual Big Picture format. For those who are not familiar, usually I talk about things that go on here in the US and then things that are going on outside of the United States. However, with the election right around the corner, in fact, the election will take place on Tuesday, November 8th, between this episode and the next one, I'm just going to be focusing on news about that election, starting with this episode. So this one's probably going to be a little bit shorter, and next week is probably just going to be nuts because the election is going to happen and then everybody's going to react and we're going to have all kinds of stuff to talk about. So with that being said, let's jump right into this and talk about what everything looks like right before the election. Starting out with an update to one of last week's stories, we had mentioned that the case around Clinton's emails wasn't reopened, but it was kind of being re-examined due to some new evidence. It is 1 week later now, and I've got an update on the story. James Comey, the director of the FBI, just released his latest statement. Here's what it says. Addressed to the chairman, it writes, I write to supplement my October 28, 2016 letter that notified you the FBI would be taking additional investigative steps with respect to former Secretary of State Clinton's use of a personal email server. Since my letter, the FBI investigative team has been working around the clock to process and review a large volume of emails from a device obtained in connection with an unrelated criminal investigation. During that process, we reviewed all of the communications that were to or from Hillary Clinton while she was Secretary of State. Based on our review, we have not changed our conclusions that we expressed in July with respect to Secretary Clinton. I am very grateful to the professionals at the FBI for doing an extraordinary amount of high-quality work in a short period of time. So, that's it. It looks like the Clinton email case is officially closed. Now, without getting into what the case was initially all about, because I've covered it before, and it's a big, stinky mess with lots of he said, she said stuff and leaked emails and things like that. The most recent part of that investigation didn't actually involve it being reopened, although a lot of news sites reported it as such. Just to do a quick recap from last week, here's what it looked like. The investigation was being re-examined due to some new emails that were found. These emails were not actually from Clinton or her server, rather they were just related to the case, and as such just needed to be looked at again in connection to the rest of the case. And that is what that letter was all about, pretty much saying that after being re-examined, they found no reason to change their verdict, which was not guilty. Once again, I'm not going to jump into that this episode. I've done it before, so I guess that's that. Now, this statement was just released by the FBI, so that's about all the information I've got on it right now. They haven't really talked much about what they had actually found that made them doubt anything or what happened in this most recent examination. So as more information about that does come out, if it's anything interesting, I will be sure to cover it again. But for now, it seems like the case is closed. Moving on to the Trump side of things, I've got some interesting updates on the polls. If you've been listening to the show for a few weeks now, you'll probably remember all of the times I've covered them. The debates happened and Trump absolutely tanked. At one point in mid-October, most polls speculated that Trump had well under a 20% chance of victory in the election. As we creep up on the election, that's changing. A number of polls are showing Trump at the very least coming out of that pit that he fell into in October. A few, such as a recent poll by ABC, show him actually slightly ahead of Clinton. In the polls where Trump has overtaken Clinton, it is only by a very small amount, generally within the poll's margin for error, and most of the larger nationwide polls still point to a Clinton victory. That being said, Trump's recent rise in the polls, it's definitely a big deal. I personally tend to follow 538's forecast, which considers the effects of the Electoral College and a number of other factors on the election. In that mid-October pit, 538 placed Trump's chances of winning the election at under 15% for most of that period of time. Right now, 538 projects that Trump's chances of winning have risen to 35%. That is a huge jump And that's literally happened in like the last week or so. So this is a jump right before the election actually happens. What could have caused this jump and what effects it will actually have on the election remain to be seen. So for now, take it as you may. But anybody who tells you that this election is already in the bag for either candidate, well, I don't want to say they're stupid, but right now it really looks like that's not the case. Finally, I'm going to be moving on to our last bit of pre-election news. Now, I know only 3 stories is a bit lower than we've usually got, but this last story is a huge, huge deal. To start this off, I want to mention that one of the stranger parts of this election has been the insistence, mostly on the part of Donald Trump, that the election is or will be rigged. This has given rise to a ton of viral images suggesting voter fraud on Facebook. The ones which have been investigated have thus far turned out to be hoaxes. I'm sure you may have seen 1 or 2 of them if you go on Facebook, where someone says, oh, look at this machine that turned my vote for X into Y. Just about all of those that have been investigated have been found to be hoaxes. That being said, there have been cases of claimed software issues changing votes, which definitely seems fishy to me, but verifying those has been really hard, and if that is actually an issue, it's been a very rare one. So with all of that said, it may seem a bit ironic that the biggest issues at the polls this election have been a case of voter suppression aimed largely not at Republicans, but at Democrats. The NAACP filed a lawsuit in North Carolina last week after it was found that over 6,000 voter registrations, consisting largely of Black Democrat voters, were challenged at what amounts to the last minute before the election. This was done based on one thing. Letters were mailed to these people's addresses, and if the mailing was returned as undeliverable for any reason, the voters lost their ability to vote. Now, before I get into talking about why this specifically violates the law, because I think it does, I want to point out that this is a terrible, terrible method for determining who is eligible to vote, and it is an awful way to take away someone's right to vote. First of all, this is bad because of just how last minute this is. The last minute nature of this challenge means that none of the affected people have time to react. In fact, were it not for the publicity of this case, many people probably wouldn't even know they had lost their registration until they went in to vote and were turned down. This is something that can be such a big deal. You don't have to be a minority to suffer from this. I've actually been dealing with some similar issues. If you live in an apartment or townhouse, and I live in an apartment, it can be very easy to lose mail, have mail delivered improperly, sent back without ever making it into your mailbox, etc. For me, I changed my registration over a month ago to be able to vote here in Philly as opposed to at my home, and I have yet to receive my papers in the mail. I should be good to vote, but I actually don't know. In fact, I actually received somebody else's paperwork and had to deal with that. Point is, there are a lot of flaws in this system. So with this case, and I cannot stress this enough, these flaws have been used alone without anything else to take away thousands of people's voter registrations from mostly Black Democrats with only days left until the election. I don't care which side of the aisle you're on, this should bother you. Anyway, this is clearly bad, but it also violates the law. Under the National Voter Registration Act, states may cancel voter registrations only if a voter provides written notice of a change in address, or if a voter does not respond to a notice for 2 election cycles and fails to vote for 2 federal election cycles. On top of this is the big part, states may not remove voters from the polls in a systemic way within 90 days of a federal election. Doing so is illegal, no questions asked, under federal law. This law was put in place to prevent large portions of a voter base from being suppressed last minute, which is exactly what just happened. Because this just went down in the past week, the outcome of this controversy isn't really clear yet, but voter suppression like this hasn't been seen in this country for a long time. Like I said, I don't care which side of the aisle you're on, this sort of behavior is disgusting and is not under any circumstances acceptable. The issue has made it to a national level and will hopefully be resolved by election night. Sadly, that leaves very little time. On that note, I'm going to end it here for today. The election is right around the corner. I'm sure next week's episode is going to be some crazy stuff. If you can, get out and vote. I don't care who you're voting for, but a lot of people have died for you to have that power. As our last story has shown, more people are still fighting to take it away. You ought to use it. Anywho, I'm Tony Pearson signing out on behalf of WHIP. Tune in next week to hear all about the election.